Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History as we look at America in the 1920s. As the decade after World War I was a period of great prosperity for most of America, although after the Great War ended, which brought prosperity to so many Americans, food prices fell, badly hurting farmers in the United States. So for the 1920s, while many people were having a very prosperous decade, farmers, for the most part, were not. But the growing economy outside the agricultural sector was based on manufacturing, particularly because of the innovations of Henry Ford. Although he did not invent the automobile, he did develop a new and better way to produce them. Of course, mass production was not a new idea, but Ford developed it to its logical end, the assembly line, which admittedly he did not invent either, but developed from what he'd seen somewhat horrifyingly in meat packing plants. On the assembly line, as with mass production in general, manufacturing was broken down into its simplest steps. Every person on the assembly line performed, for Ford, 1 out of 84 single steps, each installing a single part of a new car. And on the assembly line, conveyor belts or overhead hooks brought what you were working on to you. You did not even waste time walking from one workstation to the next to pick up what you needed to work on or take your piece on to the next man. Everything came to you, and everything was efficient as it could be. And amongst the 84 steps in producing the Model T car, one, of course, was painting it. And to keep things simple and efficient, the Model T could come in any color you wanted as long as you wanted it black. Of all the major colors of paint, it was cheapest, most durable, and fastest to dry, the most efficient color for his car. And Ford was able to do this because he hired experts in scientific management, efficiency experts, based on the ideas of Frederick Winslow Taylor, sometimes known as Taylorism. Frederick Winslow Taylor carried out time and motion studies. He or another efficiency expert, a newly developing industry, would go into factories and would observe the workers at their jobs, timing how long it took them to do every single step of the process, and then finding ways to shave a few seconds off of that to make actions as efficient as possible. Some workers saw this as insulting, even dehumanizing, but Taylorism worked. And so, mass production on the assembly line allowed cars to be made so cheaply. For Ford, one car every 90 minutes by 1910, and so cheaply that cars went from being a toy for the rich, something Woodrow Wilson called a picture of the arrogance of wealth, such that the first time a car visited Johnson City, there was a newspaper article about it, to costing in 1908 $850 for a new car, and that price continued dropping. By 1927, you could have a Model T for $290. It was more money than that is today, but that was still pretty cheap. Indeed, Ford said part of the reason for his success was that he made a car that the men who built it could afford to buy. In 1919, 10% of Americans owned a car. By 1927, 56% had an automobile. Ford eventually doubled his workers' wages from $2.35 a day to $5 a day. To keep workers on the job as the repetition threatened to burn them out. He eventually reduced their working day to 8 hours, and in 1936 began giving his workers both Saturday and Sunday off, creating the idea of the weekend. Although reducing working hours and the working week in the 1930s was partly a cost-saving measure during the Great Depression, Ford felt it was better to reduce all his workers' wages and keep them all around in case the economy recovered. He'd have them there, rather than firing some and keeping the rest on at their older, longer working day. And so with more and more money and more time to drive around, Ford's workers bought his cars, which meant people needed gasoline. And Americans searched for oil deposits and found them in the Southwest, the United States and elsewhere. The United States would be the world's major exporter of oil for decades. And the country spread out. Roadside diners sprang up. Of course, gas stations, roadside tourist attractions, in many cases date to the 1920s. Cars were also referred to as motors at the time. And along roads, people built motor hotels for people traveling by car. Motor hotel got slurred into motel. People began to use railroads less, although during World War I, the Railroad Administration had cut back on passenger services. Anyway, streetcars and other forms of public transportation were also used less. And people continued to do what they had been doing since mass transit did become widespread, and now moved from city centers to suburbs. But now, with cars, doing so even more. Although not everyone appreciated these changes. For example, in Tennessee, farmers who were accustomed to taking their goods to market in wagons resisted attempts to pay for the construction of paved roads. They said spending money on paved roads was just a waste of taxpayers' dollars, because a horse and wagon doesn't need a paved road. In fact, the pavement is kind of hard on the horse's hooves. Paving roads was just a favor for the rich car owners of the city. Until Governor Austin Peay, who was in the 1920s a progressive governor for Tennessee, found a way that was seen as fair to pay for paving roads, which was by taxing gasoline. That way only people who used gasoline and wanted a paved road could pay for it. And ever since, Tennessee's gas taxes paid for some of the best maintained highways in America. If you don't think Tennessee has good highways, just visit, say, North Carolina or New Jersey. And people weren't just buying more cars, but more of almost everything, as mass consumption became even more massive. In part because advertising was becoming more widespread and more creative, becoming a profession in its own right. So we see Babe Ruth endorsing soda pop. Here we have an advertisement for this lady here. Often a bridesmaid, but never a bride. An advertisement for Listerine. If only she used mouthwash, maybe she could have gotten married. Advertising became so influential that in 1925, Bruce Barton published a book called The Man Nobody Knows, a discovery of the real Jesus. And Bruce Barton said that Jesus was the founder of modern business. So he was a self-confident executive who had junior executives. His apostles and disciples were his vice presidents, and a sort of traveling sales force. He said Jesus' parables were an effective means of advertising, boiling big ideas down to simple, memorable stories. Now, this was not meant to be insulting to the life of Christ or his preaching and teaching, but rather it was supposed to take a familiar story and use as a way to show a modern man how to have a successful business. Although some people did view this as being a little bit much. People were able to buy things on such a large scale because, while it also was not new, the installment plan became far more common, in which someone who wanted to buy something could make a small down payment and then weekly or monthly payments until they had paid off what they wanted. Things they might once have had to save for months or years to buy. And so as people could buy things more easily, manufacturers produced more. As manufacturers produced more, they could pay their workers higher wages. As workers made more money, they could feel confident enough to buy more things, even if that meant buying them on the installment plan, which was a way of going into debt, although many people didn't necessarily see it that way. And just as there were new things to buy and new ways to buy them, there were new places to buy them. In 1879, Frank Woolworth opened what he called a 5 and dime store. Every product cost 5 or 10 cents, essentially the dollar store of the late 18 and early 1900s. And things were simply stacked up on tables. Customers could come in, look at the products, pick out what they wanted, because pricing was simple, either a nickel or a dime. Of course, if you spent too much, you could be nickel and dime to death. This meant you didn't need a trained sales force to help shoppers. Prior to this, if you wanted to buy most things in a store, you had to go either to a specialty shop or maybe a general store, give a list to a clerk in the store, and he or she would go around and pick out what you wanted. This made shopping, though, more affordable, more convenient. And Woolworths became a major chain found across the United States and around the world. And when Woolworth built a skyscraper to be his corporate headquarters in 1913, the Woolworth Building was the tallest building in New York City and in the world, a record it would hold until 1930. Woolworth put out in the lobby a statue of himself holding a nickel. Shopping became more modern, too, with the development of the first true self-service grocery store, Piggly Wiggly, founded in Memphis, Tennessee in 1916 by Clarence Sanders. In other places to buy food, you would give your order to a clerk who gathered everything up from the store shelves. But at Piggly Wiggly, you could simply walk up and down the aisles, pick things up for yourself, and put in a shopping basket. A new idea. So you no longer needed a clerk. Eventually, he even put wheels on a basket and invented the shopping cart. So people could shop for themselves, not needing a trained clerk, applying the ideas of unskilled labor to a type of mass production and mass consumption in shopping. And as more and more people owned cars, that meant too they could carry more stuff home. So people bought more and more food on each trip to the store, but made fewer trips. Also important, as people were living further from the city centers, thanks again to their cars. And as old businesses grew and new businesses were created, people invested in the stock market. As rising profits led to rising stock values. Even people invested with relatively modest incomes and little experience in investment. Some made fortunes, but it was a gamble, as stocks can fall rather than rise in value. And the ability to buy stock, but also the risk in buying stock, was increased by increasingly widespread use of buying stock on margin. It's not an entirely new idea, but buying stock on margin involved going through an investment bank and borrowing most of the money to buy the stock. You might have to put down as little as 10% of the stock's value if you purchased it on margin. Of course, the expectation is, as the stock goes up in value, you will resell the stock and make enough money to pay off what you still owe, and then a nice profit for yourself, which for much of the 1920s worked for many people. But should the value of the stock ever fall below what you paid for it, you still owe what you borrowed in the first place. And so this had the potential to ruin investors, especially those depending on just one or a few stocks. But for most of the 1920s, so many stocks were rising so quickly, it seemed like a great system. By 1929, about 4 million Americans, or about 4% of the U.S. population, owned stock, which may not seem like a lot compared to today, where you can buy stocks over the internet and it's pretty easy, and where many people own stock without even realizing they own stock, as many people with, say, a retirement plan actually have their money invested in the stock market by whatever company manages their retirement. But 4% of Americans owning stock by the late 1920s was still a much larger percentage than had ever been involved in the stock market before. And of course, as businesses boomed, so did the need for office space. And a new wave of skyscrapers was built in the early 1900s. especially the 1920s, but with the Woolworth Building and others, even before that. In 1931, the Empire State Building was completed. But by that time, the economy was no longer booming, and no more buildings of that size would be built for decades. At 1,250 feet high for the tallest occupied floor, or 1,435 feet, 8.5 inches, counting the spire on the top, this was the tallest building in the world from 1931 to 1972, when the World Trade Center was built as a taller building. It in turn was surpassed by the Sears Tower in Chicago in 1974, which of course is no longer known as the Sears Tower, Sears having been forced to sell it off during their financial troubles the past decade or so. And today, the very tallest buildings are in Asia, especially if we include the Middle East in Asia. And this economic boom was strongly supported by the U.S. government, as the more conservative wings of the two major parties once again became dominant over the progressives, at least at the presidential level. In 1920, Warren G. Harding was elected, promising a return to normalcy, to get back to American life as it was before the reforms of the progressive age and the moral diplomacy of World War I and other overseas adventures. And Harding appointed a number of pretty impressive people to his cabinet and elsewhere in the government, although a number who were less impressive too. His Secretary of the Treasury was Andrew Mellon, one of the wealthiest men in America. He cut taxes, but also presented a budget to Congress, which they largely adopted, that cut government spending significantly. And the tax cuts may have allowed businesses to spend or invest more money, given the average consumer more money to spend, and the economy grew. Even with tax rates lowered, the booming economy actually let the government take in as much money as it needed or more. Hoover and Mellon overall reduced government regulation of businesses. As traditional Republicans, they felt the best way to help the economy was by raising the tariff. And over the course of the 1920s, the tariff was raised several times, making foreign goods more expensive, making American goods more competitive, at least in America. But as America raised our tariffs, other countries raised their tariffs in response, making it harder to export American goods. In the short run, this was good for America's economy, but it also slowed down the world economy overall. And should the time ever come that we wanted to export manufactured goods, it would be a lot harder to do so. Besides Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury, President Hoover appointed former and future Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State. His Secretary of Commerce was the great humanitarian and wealthy businessman Herbert Hoover, one of the most respected Americans on earth. But not every member of his cabinet was quite as distinguished. Because although Harding was friendly and popular and likable, he wasn't all that bright. He didn't like the hard work of being president. He let his cabinet and other advisors do a lot of the work for him. And unfortunately, a number of them were deeply corrupt, to match or even exceed the Grant administration. Many members of the government under Harding's watch spent fortunes in taxpayer money on things made by their own businesses or those of their friends. The most infamous scandal to come out of the Harding administration came when the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, managed to get control of the U.S. Navy's emergency oil reserves, some in Elk Hills, California, some at Teapot Dome in Wyoming, named after a hill that looks, if you use your imagination, kind of like a teapot. Having got control of the nation's emergency oil reserves, he then leased that oil to big business at a very low price in exchange for big bribes to himself. Eventually this was discovered in the Teapot Dome scandal, and Fall went to jail, the first sitting U.S. cabinet member to be indicted and imprisoned for a crime. The Attorney General, Harry Doherty, was involved in a number of scandals, although we don't know everything he did, as one of his assistants committed suicide after being discovered destroying government papers that were presumably incriminating. Likewise, an assistant to the director of the Veterans Bureau, a forerunner of the Veterans Administration, also committed suicide when it was discovered he was helping his boss skim money off the Veterans Bureau account. They're also running an illegal drug and alcohol smuggling business through the VA. And the assistant to the director of the Bureau committed suicide. The director himself went to jail. Now Harding, as best we can tell, did not personally profit from any of this. It's not clear how much he even knew about it. But he also certainly didn't do anything to stop it. There are also other scandals in his background. A woman, for example, claimed that she had given birth to an illegitimate child from Warren G. Harding, which was a surprise as Harding was believed to be sterile, having no children of his own. But many years later, DNA evidence proved Harding did at least have that illegitimate child he was accused of. Still, these scandals were not known during Harding's short time in office, as while on a trip to the West Coast, he died. No autopsy was performed. And so there are always rumors that he died under shady circumstances, possibly even that his wife poisoned him. All the official reason was heart failure. At the time of his death, there was a huge outpouring of sorrow in the United States. As the record of his cabinet became better known, the sympathy diminished. Harding was replaced by a man who, at least in his integrity, was much different. Calvin Coolidge, a man who was quiet, careful, honest. He had a reputation for being quiet, so he was nicknamed Silent Cal. There were jokes about this. It was said that at a dinner party, a woman once said to him, "Mr. President, I made a bet I can get you to say 3 words tonight." And Calvin Coolidge replied, "You lose." Supposedly at a church, someone asked him what the sermon was about, and he said, "Sin." What did the preacher say about sin? He's against it. When Coolidge died some years later, a writer of the day asked, "How can you tell?" Although the story of him becoming president is kind of sweet. He found out that the president had died while he was visiting his parents in Vermont. And his father was actually a local government official, and he was sworn in the house he grew up in by his father on the family Bible. Although, just to be safe, they had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court swear him in later when he got back to Washington, D.C. That being William Howard Taft, appointed by Warren G. Harding. Silent Cal supported big business. He famously said, "The business of America is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there." He continued to keep taxes low, government spending low, and the tariff high. He was elected to a term of his own in 1924, and during his 6 years as president, America enjoyed great prosperity. And although Warren G. Harding had promised a return to normalcy, and for many people normalcy did include isolationism, in fact, America did remain involved in the world. Maybe not in the League of Nations, but in some very important international diplomacy nonetheless. We did want to avoid future wars. And to help prevent future wars, the United States invited leaders from many of the great and minor naval powers of the world to Washington, D.C. for the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922. There, many world powers met and agreed to 3 separate treaties that reduced the size of their navies, placing limits on the tonnage of major ships they could have, although different countries had different limits. In the biggest of these three treaties, the Five-Power Treaty, it was agreed that the United States and Britain could still maintain the world's biggest navies, 5 times the size of France or Italy's navies, them being the fourth and fifth powers in the Five-Power Treaty. In between, Japan was allowed a navy 3 times that of France or Italy, but not quite as big as Britain or the United States, which some Japanese found kind of insulting. Although to make up for that, Japan did convince the United States and Britain to recognize that Japan had special interests in the Pacific, and the U.S. and Britain agreed not to build any new fortifications in the Philippines or certain other areas we controlled in the Far East. Something we might regret here in, say, 19 years. And there were also some other limits agreed to by other, less important, but still, naval powers. Of course, Germany's navy and army had already been severely limited by the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany could have no air force whatsoever. And furthermore, there were some loopholes in these limitations on a naval arms race. Certain types of ships were not covered by the limitations, and some countries just built more of those ships. The United States began building more aircraft carriers, as did Japan, as those were not fully covered by the treaty. Smaller ships like cruisers and destroyers and submarines were not limited as much, and Japan started building lots of those. Indeed, a number of countries began to skirt the letter of the agreement, and as time passed, the U.S. did nothing when the Italians, the French, and especially the Japanese violated the shipbuilding limits outright, as Americans were eager to believe that the Great War really had ended all war. Indeed, the world was so confident that war could end that in 1928 it was decided to simply outlaw war. In 1928, the United States and France created the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war completely, or at least offensive war. You can fight a war if you're attacked, and a clever diplomat, of course, can prove that any war is defensive. 62 countries did sign this agreement banning war, which is why we've had no war since 1928. Although there were problems. Germany in particular was having a real hard time paying back its reparations, which at first had kind of been the idea. France in particular wanting to break the German economy so they could no longer be a threat to other countries, especially France. But as Germany struggled to pay their reparations in gold, this threatened to undermine not just Germany's economy, but Europe's, and to be a problem for the United States, as during World War I, the U.S. had lent a lot of money to Britain and France, but we couldn't be paid back in full until Germany paid them. And so the United States decided essentially to refinance Germany's reparations. With the Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1930, the U.S. lent money to Germany so that Germany could pay back the money they owed to Britain and France, who in turn paid that money on to the United States. Then Germany would eventually repay the money they were lent by the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, but on longer and more generous terms, again such that they finally paid us back in October of 2010. They're still paying for World War II, although we don't talk about that very much. So even in Germany, things seem to be getting better, in large part with American help. Now, in 1928, Calvin Coolidge had served 1.5 terms and decided that he would not run for another term. Silent Cal never said why. But the Republicans now nominated to follow him Herbert Hoover, the great humanitarian, who had been in both Harding and Coolidge's cabinet, and was still admired for his war relief efforts during and after the Great War. And Hoover promised to continue America's prosperity with a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage.